Ernesto Che Guevara, one of the most important people in the history of Latin America. But sadly, it's been mythologized to the point that people forget his more problematic tendencies. This is an anarchist critique of Ernesto Che Guevara, and I am more agreement with his grandson, who was exiled from the Cuban government for his activism, criticizing the Cuban government as a capitalist society, which, while Castro was still alive, was considered as a monarchy and dynasty, and health inequality, police brutality against Afro-Cubans, and discrimination and imprisonment of anarchists and LGBT activists in Cuba. We must understand that Ernesto Che Guevara, who was the founder of the government that we have today for Cuba, was originally a communist revolution. It was originally a liberal middle class revolution, and Castro at first believed in liberalism, not communism, until much later. This will be from the article Larry Gambone, Saint Che, The Truth Behind the Legend of the Heroic Guerrilla Ernesto Che Guevara. From the quote of G. Paul Sartre, Che was the most complete human being of our age. Let's see about that. A peasant woman lights a candle to the saint and prays that her young son will get well and potato crop will be a big one this year. Her prayers and the prayers of other peasants have been answered before. And claimed the villagers. He looked just like our old Lord lying there dead in the schoolhouse. She tells the television interview the name of his miracle working saint, Ernesto Che Guevara. Let's laugh at these peasants. Don't look down upon them with developed world arrogance. No doubt Che does intervene into poverty-stricken lives, as do all other saints. Who are we to claim absolute knowledge of the world and human mind and all its workings? How would Che feel about the incense and candles burned in his name? As a militant communist and atheist, he would have dismissed it all as cruel superstition from reactionary past. How ironic for such a person to become a saint. But not only Bolivian peasants have revered from the dead guerrilla 30 years after his murder, his picture is plastered on the walls of all the student residents of the world. His stern aesthetic gaze stares out at you from innumerable t-shirts and badges. The Che Guevara mystique is all pervasive. One can't help asking whether he deserved this idolatry. At first glance, one would easily give an unqualified information answer. Here was someone given to number 2 position in Cuba, who stepped down to fight in the jungle for what he believed was liberation. Sick with asthma and with a tiny band of followers, he was hunted down and murdered by the Bolivian army and the United States government. Guevara was also the perfect romantic figure, handsome, charismatic, and generally loved by women. No lifeless intellectual Stalin crow, he nor secret pervert like Mao, or the megalomania like his old friend Fidel, but a real man. He could step out any romantic novel. He does look Christ-like lying dead in that famous photograph. Yes, it is possible to understand the fascination that many people, particularly the young, have with the man, but understanding a phenomenon is one thing, whether it presents a true picture of reality is another. For this, we must look behind the mystique. The young Che, or Don't Cry for Me, Argentina. During Che Guevara's formative years, Argentina was dominated by the Peronist movement. Peronism, largely the invention of Perón's brilliant wife Eva, was the nearest thing to perfect fascism that ever existed, at least for Latin America. Forget about all the propaganda and foolishness that has been thrust around the world. Fascists. Forget about Nazi fascism and the clerical fascism of Franco and Salazar. By fascist, I mean the true answer what is a revolutionary movement or left-wing fascism. True pure fascism, as envisioned by Mussolini, grew out of the militant left wing of Italian socialism. It was an attempt to impose the social democratic program through dictatorship and armed force. The movement dispensed with the sterile positivism, evolutionism, or orthodox Marxism, substituting romantic emotionalism, extreme nationalism, a code of the will of a man of action. The goal was to nationalize industry and to subordinate all classes of the needs of the state. The working class were to benefit from the revolution, but only so long as they remained subservient to fascist state. Mussolini's problem was that he never had the support of the working class, and thus had to turn to the traditional middle classes. Thus much of his revolution only remained on paper. This was not the situation we faced with Perón. More than 50 years before they took power, the generals smashed the powerful anarcho-syndicalist trade unions and only small remnants remained. The workers were poor, unorganized, and voiceless. Even to Perón, who was able to build a labor movement by filling an organizational vacuum where necessary to smash her weakened opponents. Thus, Peronism, Argentine fascism, had a solid base among the workers, with prodding from an ever-energetic Evita. The movement nationalized the banks, insurance companies, mines, and railroads. As a result, Argentina had probably the largest state capitalist sector outside of Stalinist regime. Wages were forced up by degree as a host of social benefits introduced for los descamisados, literally the shirtless ones, the working class followers of the Perons. Even the church was attacked. The anti-imperialist game was played to excess, alternative between violent anti-Americanism and anti-British sentiment. The foreigners were made the scapegoat for all Argentines' problems. Che Guevara was sympathetic to Peronism and embittered most of his ideas. In many ways, he was to remain under the spell of the Peronist fascist ideology all of his life. In 1955, after he had opted for Stalin, he would also claim that he had to give Peron all possible support. When Perón failed to state, I will confess with all sincerity that the fall of Perón deeply embedded me. Argentina was the palliative of all those who think the enemy is in the north. During the Cuban Revolution, Che called his new guerrilla recruits los descamisados, the name Perón gave to his followers. If you want to learn more about these details of his relationship with Argentinian fascists that he still holds out even at the end of his life, I highly recommend Che, A Revolutionary Life. It's the best book about the life of Che Guevara. If you prefer a documentary, I highly recommend my personal favorite is Che, A New Man. Or if you want a movie, I recommend a two-parter movie called Che. This affection for Peronism never ceased. Che told Angel Porrelli, Perón's former Minister of the Interior in 1961, that Perón was the most advanced embodiment of political and economic reform in Latin America. In 1962, Che declared that Peronism had to be included within Argentina's revolutionary front. Fidel asked Perón to visit Cuba. John Cook, Perón's personal representative, visited Cuba and lauded the revolution. The fascist roots of Che's worldview. One can see Peronist and general fascist influence in many aspects of Che's thinking in terms of what was needed to make a revolution. Che believed that what was required to make political headway was strong leadership and willingness to use force. Che was never concerned about Fidel's dictatorial or autocratic ways. He believed the true revolution could only be achieved by a strong man. He was also had a fascist obsession with the willpower, will overcome everything. Destiny can be achieved by willpower. Die, yes, but riddled with bullets. A memory more lasting than my name is to fight to die fighting. Thus wrote a 18-year-old Guevara in 1947. This was not just teenage melodrama. At the age of 25, while in Guatemala, Che had a revelation in which he wrote, "And I see how I die as a sacrifice to the true standardizing revolution of wills. Now my body contorts, ready for the fight, and I prepare my being as it were sacred place, so that the bestial howling of a proletariat can resonate." Fascist ideology dismissed moderation and rational compromise with contempt, seeing these as weaknesses and decadence. For Che, moderation was something to be avoided at all costs. It was one of the most execrable qualities. Not only am I not a moderate, I should try not ever to be, and I recognize that the sacred flame within me has given way to timid vaudeville light. The least I could do is vomit over my own shit, he wrote in 1956. Many years later, he expressed the opinion that all those who are afraid or consider some form of treason are moderates. He had a very poor opinion of the populist revolutionaries such as Venezuela Pentarcos and Costa Rica Figueres, feeling that their willingness to compromise with the Americans was a result of weakness and lack of resolve. Even though Fidel Castro tried to make alliances with the United States at the beginning before the United States rejected him during the Red Scare, and that's why he joined the Soviet Union and accidentally causing the missile crisis. Fascism also glorifies war and idolizes militarism and the military. Che identified war as the ideal circumstance in which to achieve socialist consciousness. He regarded the Revolutionary Army as the principal political arm of the revolution and felt that the freedom of the press was dangerous. If you want to read where I read that quote, it's from Che, A Revolutionary Life, page 422, where he clearly stated that the freedom of the press was a bad thing. Rabid nationalism, hate-mongering, and the scapegoating of other nations and peoples has always been an important aspect of fascism. Che was obsessed with the idea that the US was to blame for everything. This scapegoating began to take serious shape in his first motorbike tour of Argentina in 1950 when he discovered rural poverty. He had a deep-seated hostility toward the US. The only thing he liked about this country were its poets and novelists. Che once said, "I die with a smile on my lips fighting these people, the Americans." He often referred xenophobically to the blondes of the North, but was ever so ready to join those other blondes of the North, the Russians. The positive aspect of Afro-colonialism for Che was the hate which colonialism had left in the minds of the people. Nihilism and the view that the end justified the means are essential fascist traits, also shared with Marxism, especially within the Leninist tradition. All of the past must be swept away in the great conflagration of the superior new man, created by force if necessary. The new man is necessary for the old man. Present humanity is weak and bourgeois, and is only useful as a cannon fodder in the struggle for the glorious future. To sacrifice a generation or two for the cause is nothing to get upset about according to the fascist mentality. As he stated, almost everything we fought and felt in the past epoch should be filed away and a new type of human being created. His willingness to sacrifice innumerable lives for the glorious future made the beating and imprisonment and mission by the barons seem gentle by comparison. After the Russians withdrew their rockets ended the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, Che fumed over the Soviet betrayal and told the Daily Worker in London report, "If the missile had been under Cuban control, they would have fired them off." The reporter thought he was crackers from the way he went on about the missiles. In 1965, he demanded a revolutionary apocalyptic world war. If it unleashed the atomic bomb, thousands of people would die anywhere, but that would not worry us, emphasis added. Out of this mass destruction, the new socialist order was supposed to arise. Che's plan for an ill-fated Bolivian campaign entitled that Bolivia was to be sacrificed for the cause of creating the condition for revolutions in neighboring countries. The idea was to cause a new Vietnam-type wars in Latin America, thereby beating down and weakening the US. This was to cause Russia and China plus the Third World guerrilla movement to unite in one powerful bloc to then destroy the United States. Once again, even though such a scheme might bring about atomic war. Che's mention to the Tricontinental meeting in Havana in April 1967 brought his fascist, nihilist, and romantic impulses to a gory climax. He desired nothing less than a long and cruel global confrontation. The important quality required in the World War was a relentless hatred impelling us above and beyond the natural limitations that man is heir to, transforming him into an effective, violent, seductive, and cold killing machine. Ephesus added, "This war must be total and waged inside the US as well as without, waged until Americans' moral fiber begins to decline, which was to be symptomatic of US decadence. How close we look into our bright future should there many Vietnams flourish, our every action a battle hymn for the people's unity against the greatest enemy of mankind. The USA, whatever death may surprise us, let it be welcome." It must be mentioned that the glorification of death is a distinctly fascist trait, and the fight against long-lived death is echoed in the Castroite slogan Patria o Muerte, or the nation of death in Cuba. Che, the Stalinist. In 1955, Che had become a convinced Stalinist, writing, "I have sworn before a picture of the old and more comrade Stalin that I won't rest until I see these capitalist octopuses annihilated." He had remained a skeptic about Marxism until his discovery of Stalin in his books. While in Guatemala, Che had some level of sympathy for the USSR and wrote off anti-communism as a sample of low culture. It is not that difficult to make the passion from fascism to Stalinism, or the reverse for that matter. The similarities between the two ideologies, the glorification of violence, dictatorship, statism, nationalism, scapegoating, tend to outweigh their differences. Where there is a difference is in the realm of philosophy. Stalinism, unlike fascism, still clings to the pseudoscientific baggage of Marxism, believes that the laws of social development are on their side, give the Stalinists a sense of psychological comfort. It also creates an unbreakable contradiction, an undeniable philosophy which is woodily deterministic combined with a practice which is highly voluntaristic. The party being the subject of history, i.e. the group that makes the revolution and controls the future development of the socialist state. For Che's focal theory, which dispensed with the party and mass movement in favor of a tiny band of guerrillas, this contradiction is intensified to the ultimate degree. See the difficulty which he tried to overcome this problem. Around the time of the Bay of Pigs invasion, 1962, Che wrote, "The peasant class of America basing itself on the ideology of the working class, whose great thinker discovered the social laws govern us. However, what was missing was the so-called subjective factor, the consciousness of the possibility of victory, which was to be galvanized by the guerrilla band's armed struggle." As a Stalinist, Che had some extremely important duty to perform in interest of the Communist movement and the Soviet Union. The first of these was to reorient the 26th of July movement in the direction of Stalinism. Very few people on the movement were communists or even communist sympathizers. Other revolutionary groups like the Directorate or the Architects or the Anarchists were militarily anti-Stalinist. Che and Raul Castro were Stalinists. Fidel was friendly to the Communist Party but quiet about it. He was actually a liberal during these times. Che became the key participant in the delicate talks with the Popular Socialist Party or the Cuban Communist Party. He worked secretly to cement ties with the Popular Socialist Party. The alliance between the 26th of July and the Popular Socialist Party had to be secret, not to split the revolutionary movement and arouse American hostility. Most Cuban patriots hated CP, which was very late in getting into the struggle and had formerly been in alliance with Batista beforehand. After the revolution, Che became a liaison between the KGB and the new revolutionary government, where relations between Cuba and Russia had to be clandestine, not to anger the average Cuban, frightened the U.S. State Department. As the former KGB agent who was involved with him stated, Che was practically the architect of our relations with Cuba, nor was this the only relation he had with the Russians. The nuclear missile deals with Russia, which almost started World War III, was also concluded by Che. By 1963, Che had become despondent as he realized the Russian model, which in his naivety had a passionate embrace, was not very good. Soon after, evidently not learning from his mistake with Stalinism, he became enamored with Maoism, writing Sacrifice Fundamental. The Chinese understand this very well, much better than Russians do. Early on, Che also had special praise for China and North Korea. Che the Executioner. In the Sierra Maestra, Che was always quick to demand execution for guerrillas and local peasants who were not up to his standards. Informers, insubordinates, managers, and deserters got a bullet in the head. Fidel was far more tolerant of human frailty and reserved several of Che's execution orders. Executions were quite frequent during the guerrilla campaign. He was notoriously severe with his punishment. One time he threatened to shoot a number of guerrillas who had gone on hunger strike over bad provisions. Only Fidel's intervention stopped him. Shortly after the fall of Batista, Che helped to form the C2 of the new secret police. He was also in charge of purging the army and government bureaucracy of traitors, spies, and Batista henchmen. However, it was mostly minor individuals that were arrested, since the officers and top bureaucrats fled with the dictator. Che was the supreme persecutor who made the final decision to execute or not. And execute he did. Che was merciless, and between January and April 1959, more than 550 people were shot by the firing squad. By January 1960, alleged Batista supporters were not the only ones getting the bullets. Some young Catholics were executed for distributing anti-communist leaflets. Che is implicated in the destruction of Cuban narco-syndicalism and Trotskyism as well. Cuba in 1950 was the scene of the last great Latin American syndicalist movement. Libertarians controlled many trade unions and were important anti-Batista force. The anarchists had survived the Machado and Batista dictatorship, but did not survive 2 years of Castroism. By 1962, the movement was down to 20 or 30 members. Hundreds of others had fled into exile, imprisoned, or executed for, and it was still harboring any illusions about Che's alleged libertarianism. The following court should put this to rest. Individualism must disappear in Cuba. It should be the proper utilization of the whole individual for the absolute benefit of the community. Such an opinion of the individual was about as far removed from anarchism and libertarianism as you could possibly get. Che the bureaucrat. Late in 1959, university autonomy, which had managed to survive under Batista, was abolished with Che's approval. A new state curriculum was introduced, and the universities became simple tools of the regime. In 1960, the National Institution of Agrarian Reform was formed under Che. This organization took control of the entire economy and initially thought its job was to run the state co-ops. Now, a state co-op is a contradiction in terms, for co-ops are by nature voluntary associations locally owned and managed. What the INRA did was to nationalize the city co-ops, some of which were anarchists, and set up a host of new phony co-ops, essentially state farms. On February 20, 1960, Che announced Soviet-style planning for Cuba, something that had been his desire all along. Che's tenure as head of the Cuban economy was a thorough disaster and probably helped propel him toward his suicidal Bolivian exploit. As head of the Cuban economy, Che was ultimately responsible for the violation of workers' rights and the destruction of the independent trade union movement. Of the former, by the late 1960s, workers had lost their right to strike, job security, sick leave, and the 44-hour week. Over time, they at time and half paid vacations and were forced to do voluntary labor. As for the trade unions, as well as liquidating anarcho-syndicalism, the regime trying to get the Communist Party slate elected to the leadership of the Cuban Labor Confederation. This was rejected by 90% of the delegates. The Stalinists were imposed from above by the state. The leader of the CTC, David Salvador, an important member of the 22nd July, no less, was sentenced to 30 years in prison for his opposition to the Stalinist takeover of his union. He spent his time behind bars in prison with some 700 other political prisoners, many who no doubt were trained unionists. Che's guilt in these matters would not be plainer, for in October 1960 he stated the destiny of unions is to disappear, and supported Law 647, by which the Minister of Labor can control of any union, dismiss officials, and appoint others. The tragedy of Che Guevara. Che's strip of the mythology isn't too pretty of a sight, unless you are modern people who are full of hate, violence, and apologies for depositism. But let us not go too far with this. Che was no reptile-eyed sociopath like Stalin or some bloodless intellectual fanatic such as Pol Pot. Until he became a guerrilla Savonarola Sierra Maestra, he was known for being a joker and a prankster, a hippie before his time, a lover of poetry, late-night conversation, travel soccer, food, motorcycles, and women. Few of his friends could believe the transformation they had overcome their old pal, El Chanco, after he went to Cuba. El Chanco was his nickname, and means the pig. He was called this because of his fondness for dirty rag clothing and his aversion to bathing, one of his ways of rebelling against his upper-class origins. Che was essentially a normal but rebellious, intelligent, and well-read young man. Something happened to him. Yes, he had absorbed many of the unpleasant ideas of Perón, but so had lots of people. Such individuals went on with their lives and were not destroyed by an ideology. Politics really wasn't all that important to Che until he went to Guatemala. There he discovered ideology which clicked. His underlying beliefs and prejudice seemed to explain the world he gave his life substance and meaning. Che was fundamentally normal, decent human being who became a slave of a cruel secular religion. His beliefs simply consumed him, forcing him to do things he would not normally do. He hated himself hard and fanatical. As his father, Guerilla, legislated, Ernesto brutalized his sensibility to become a revolutionary. His mother characterized this new Ernesto as intolerant and fanatical. His parents were not opposed to left-wing politics, only what these politics were doing to their son. Che was, for all of his reading, essentially naive, considered naivety of becoming a Stalinist in 1955, not breaking with the code during the Khrushchev revelations of 1956, when thousands of Western intellectuals fled to the Communist Party. And then, at the very end, wishing to exchange Russian Stalinism with Chinese Maoism. Is not that the horrors of Stalinism were not well known. He didn't need Skolesnytsyn to tell us about the Gulag, or any anarchist, Trotskyist, or anti-Stalinist socialist who had told him to choose. Perhaps one did, but he must have refused to listen. His personal cult of the world was also naive, ultimately leading him to his death. Inspired by hearing to the belief system which incessantly dodders on about the material conditions, he ignored material reality. In his last ill-fated struggle, how could he brush aside the fact that Bolivian peasants had gotten land during the Populist Revolution in 1952 and were not interested in another armed uprising? How could he not know this? Look at his statement to the Tricontinental, as through attacking a country will break the will of his people, as though it will scare the Americans into defeat. Anybody who knows history knows well that it is not the case. Trying to terrorize a nation only heightens the resolve of its people, and if the US was the greatest enemy of mankind, what then was Russia or China with tens of millions of slaughters and the ways of megalomaniac dictators? How could he not know these things? Was it because he didn't want to? There is no denying that Che was physically very courageous. Time and time again, he put himself in the greatest danger in the guerrilla struggle. He was a truly brave warrior. While harsh in his method, he was no hypocrite. His sacrifice, his suffering were a sample to his men. But physical courage is not that rare. Many frontline soldiers had it, some criminals as well. Many people who belong to the worst sort of political or religious code of immense bravery. Another matter is the combination of physical and moral courage. The other did not have, and no one does who believe. The end justified the means. To show moral ethnic courage, he or anyone else in a position who had to be willing to sacrifice the revolution for higher humanitarian principles. Better no revolution than one based upon terror and mass murder. Better to risk the organization than shoot peasants who want to go home, deserters. But for Che, as for Stalinists, fascists, and all fanatics in general, such as principles were examples of weakness and liberal sentimentality. In fairness, however, the combination of physical and moral courage is very rare. How many of us have both these traits? Che reflects his environment but did not transcend it. He was a mirror image of Peronism, Romanticism, machismo, and xenophobia so prevalent in the 1950s Argentina. His sympathy for Stalinism was something shared by most intellectuals of the time. Even his bohemianism fit the common pattern for well-read, upper-class youth. The truly great man or great woman transcends his or her era and social environment influence, breaking time-worn habits and giving rise to a new set of ideas. Che's strip of his immense courage and fanatical zeal was therefore essentially an average man. He died for our sins. He was an everyman, not a complete man, as such is the most incomplete of mankind. Such never met a left-wing dictator or terrorist he didn't like. He is very one of us who has felt like killing a political opponent. He is every one of us who has hated someone with a different viewpoint. He is every one of us who has become sucked into the vortex of some political cult ideology. He is every one of us who apologized for terrorist acts. He is every one of us who believe by any means necessary. He is me. He is you. He only put into determining action the hates and fears we feel inside. He was a normal man, not a pervert like Hitler or Stalin or Mao. The pus who can simply be rid of as a monster does have no relationship to me and my possible curse of action. In a sense, die for our sins. A normal people trapped in ideology constrained by moral weakness and psychological problems that are incapable of resolving in a constructive manner. It doesn't sound much like a saint, does he? But there is one thing to take into account. The great sinner can sometimes become a saint. Only one example is Saint Paul, who at one time invited persecuted a Christian. Of course, Che was murdered before he had a chance to see his error, give his hard-heartedness. He may not have ever done so, but who knows? However, his suffering, self-destruction, and destruction of others, and his ultimate failure serves as an example of young people for dying. Do not follow this path. If Che's sacrifice dissuades the youth from fading into an ideological created hell, perhaps he deserves a mentor of sainthood. Maybe then he should turn to account to Saint Che and pray. Please, no more heroic gorillas. And to understand, to show you someone with similar lifestyle, but was truly committed to the struggle and not to the idealistic, even fascistic tendency, we can see examples of true heroes in the Latin America, like Augusto Santino, an anarchist, Filiberto Ojeda Rios, a Marxist-Leninist Maoist, Pedro Viso Campos, a socialist, and his wife, a Marxist-Leninist, although she wasn't as committed as him when it got to physical action, but she was still a revolutionary at heart. Emilio Zapata and Ricardo Flores Magón, both anarchists. And currently, the Zapatistas. Those are the true heroes, not the Marxist saint.